The wind was a thief. It stole the heat from your skin, the breath from your lungs, and the steadiness from your hands. Up here, at 11,000 feet in the Sierra Nevadas, the air was thin and sharp, tasting of pine and ice. Major Anya Sharma felt it scrape the back of her throat with every controlled inhale. She stood apart from the cluster of Marines, her posture a study in stillness, a stark contrast to their restless energy. They were huddled around a spotting scope, their camouflaged forms blending into the mottled granite and patches of stubborn snow. Their voices, raw and clipped, were snatched by the gusts that tore across the ridgeline. "No good, Lieutenant. Wind's pushing it a full mil left. Then it drops like a stone past 900. The voice belonged to Corporal Davies, the platoon's self-appointed expert. He had the broad shoulders and confident swagger of a man who had never been seriously challenged. "Just can't get a clean read," another voice muttered. "It's like a river up there." The target was a steel plate, man-sized, set at a distance of 1,150 meters. In perfect conditions, it was a difficult but achievable shot for a trained scout sniper team. In these conditions, with unpredictable crosswinds whipping through the mountain passes, it was a masterclass problem in ballistics. For the past hour, it had been a problem they could not solve. Pings of misses echoed faintly moments after the crack of the rifle, each one a small metallic sigh of failure. Sharma watched, her gaze analytical. She wasn't part of their unit, the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion. She was an attachment, an evaluator from a Joint Operations Command tasked with assessing high-altitude combat readiness. To them, she was a staff officer, an outsider in clean, unfrayed gear who carried a clipboard and asked pointed questions. She was a woman in a world of hardened men, and her presence was tolerated, not welcomed. She saw the frustration building in them. It wasn't just about hitting the target, it was about pride. They were Marines, they were the best, and the mountain was making fools of them. Davies missed again, the round kicking up a puff of dust a foot to the right of the plate. He swore, ejecting the casing with a sharp, angry flick of the bolt. "This is impossible," he grumbled, stepping away from the M40A6 rifle. "The dope is right. The wind is just wrong." Lieutenant Miller, a young officer whose authority seemed to rest on a fragile foundation of bravado, clapped Davies on the shoulder. "It's a tough shot, Corporal. We'll get it." But his eyes betrayed his doubt. Sharma took a slow, deliberate breath, the cold air filling her lungs. She had remained silent for hours, observing, making notes. Now she moved. Her footsteps were quiet on the rocky ground as she approached the group. The men shifted, their circle tightening almost unconsciously, a subtle barrier of shoulders and packs. "The wind isn't just pushing left," she said, her voice calm and even, cutting through the bluster. "There's an updraft from the valley floor around the 700-meter mark. It's holding the round high before the crosswind takes it. You're overcorrecting for drop." Davies turned, a smirk playing on his lips. "Oh yeah? You figure that out from your clipboard, Major?" The other Marines chuckled, a low rumble of shared amusement. They saw her rank, but they didn't see a warrior. They saw a woman, an officer from a different world, offering textbook theory to men who lived by instinct and experience. Sharma's expression did not change. Her dark eyes, steady and unblinking, met his. She ignored the jibe. She ignored the smirks. Her focus was on the problem. "May I?" she asked, her gaze shifting to the rifle resting on its bipod. The question hung in the thin air, a stark breach of protocol and etiquette. You did not touch another sniper's rifle. It was an extension of the man, a sacred instrument. The request was so unexpected, so audacious, that the laughter died in their throats. It was replaced by a stunned silence, thicker than the mountain air. Davies stared at her, his jaw tight. Lieutenant Miller looked uncomfortable, caught between military courtesy to a superior officer and the rigid, unspoken laws of his platoon. He was about to formulate a polite refusal, to explain that the equipment was calibrated, that it was a matter of unit training. But before he could speak, Sharma asked again, her voice betraying no hint of demand, only quiet purpose. "I'd like to try the shot." The training ground was a desolate amphitheater of granite and scree, chosen for its cruelty. The Pickle Meadows Mountain Warfare Training Center was designed to break men and equipment, to simulate the harshest conditions imaginable. The Marines of STA Platoon were at home here, their faces chapped by the wind, their movements economical and sure. They were a tribe, bound by shared hardship and an insular, aggressive pride. Sharma, in her capacity as an evaluator, was a foreign body. They watched her the way wolves watch a strange animal entering their territory, with suspicion and a veiled predatory curiosity. For 2 days, she had followed them, her notebook a constant presence. She documented their communication protocols, their patrol formations, their land navigation skills. She said little, her questions precise and technical. They answered in clipped monosyllables, offering the bare minimum required by her rank. The social distance was a chasm. At the evening meal, they sat together, their conversation a mix of crude jokes and technical jargon from which she was implicitly excluded. She ate alone, cleaning her mess kit with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. The institutional bias was subtle but pervasive. When she spoke to Lieutenant Miller about optimizing their loadouts for high-altitude patrols, he had nodded politely before turning to his gunnery sergeant Thorne and asking, "What do you think, Gunny?" as if her input was merely a suggestion to be validated by a real operator. When she pointed out a flaw in their comms encryption during a simulated exercise, Davies had muttered just loud enough for her to hear. "Guess the manual says so." Gunnery Sergeant Thorne was the only one who seemed to reserve judgment. He was an older man, his face a roadmap of deserts and mountains, his eyes holding a quiet, weary intelligence. He'd been in the Corps longer than most of his Marines had been alive. He watched Sharma not with suspicion, but with a flat, neutral gaze, as if she were a complex piece of terrain he was still trying to read. He saw the way she moved, not with the practiced swagger of the younger men, but with a deep, settled economy of motion, her center of gravity always low, her steps perfectly placed. He saw the way she scanned the horizon, her eyes never resting, constantly cataloging angles, cover, and concealment. These were not the habits of a staff officer. Now, on the firing line, the platoon's simmering resentment had found its voice in Davies' open mockery. His challenge was a public test. He believed he was putting an arrogant officer in her place, exposing her as a fraud who had no business questioning seasoned operators. He expected her to flush with anger or embarrassment, to retreat behind her rank. He did not expect her to call his bluff. "I'd like to try the shot." The words, simple and direct, had shifted the dynamic. It was no longer a theoretical discussion. It was a direct challenge to their identity. Lieutenant Miller cleared his throat. "Major, with all due respect, this is a highly specialized piece of equipment. It's zeroed for Corporal Davies, messing with the settings." "I won't change his zero," Sharma stated plainly. "I'll hold over." This was another surprise. Holding over for elevation and windage at that distance without touching the scope's turrets was an act of pure ballistic artistry. It required an almost supernatural understanding of the rifle, the ammunition, and the environment. It was a boast of the highest order, delivered in a voice devoid of any boastfulness. Davies let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Hold over? For a 1,200-yard shot in this wind? Ma'am, you've been watching too many movies." Gunny Thorne, who had been silent until now, spoke. His voice was gravelly, accustomed to cutting through the noise of battlefields. "Let her shoot, Lieutenant." All eyes turned to him. Thorne's word carried more weight in the platoon than Miller's rank. He was the anchor, the repository of their history and their standards. Miller looked at him, surprised. Thorne's gaze was fixed on Sharma. He saw something the others didn't, or perhaps something they refused to see. He saw the absolute lack of doubt in her posture. He saw the way her eyes were already reading the mirage shimmering off the distant rocks, tracing the invisible currents of wind. Miller, outmaneuvered and sensing a shift in the platoon's mood from derision to curiosity, finally relented. He was a young officer, and the one thing he feared more than failure was looking weak in front of his men. Denying her now, with Thorne's endorsement, would look like fear. "Fine," he said, his tone clipped. "Corporal, step aside." Davies looked stunned, then angry. He felt his authority, his status as the platoon's top shot, being publicly undermined. He backed away from the rifle with a petulant shrug, as if to say, "Don't blame me when she makes a fool of herself." He crossed his arms and leaned against a boulder, a sneer fixed on his face, ready to witness the inevitable failure. The other Marines shuffled into position, becoming an audience for the unfolding drama. This was better than training. It was a public humiliation in the making. Sharma moved forward without a word. She didn't look at Davies or the others. Her world had shrunk to the rifle, the wind, and the distant speck of steel. She approached the M40A6, not as a stranger, but as an old acquaintance. Her movements were fluid and economical. She settled behind the weapon, her body molding to the hard, cold ground. She didn't just lie down, she built a position. Her legs were splayed for stability, her ankles flat on the ground. She adjusted the small sandbag under the rifle's stock with minute, precise movements, her fingers working with practiced familiarity. She put her eye to the scope, but she didn't look through it yet. She took several long, slow breaths, her exhalation visible as a white plume in the frigid air. The men watched, their mockery turning into a tense, expectant silence. They were snipers. They recognized the ritual. This was the process of a shooter calming their system, slowing their heart rate until the space between beats was a silent, steady platform from which to launch a bullet. "Wind call?" she asked, her voice muffled by her position on the ground. Her spotter was supposed to be Davies, but he remained stubbornly by his rock. After a tense moment, Gunny Thorne moved to the spotting scope. He settled behind it, his movements mirroring hers in their economy. "Wind is variable," he reported, his voice a low monotone. "Gusting from your 2 o'clock, 7 to 10 miles per hour. Looks like a downdraft at the halfway point, then it switches, pushing hard left in the final 200. Sharma absorbed the information, her mind a complex calculator. She wasn't just hearing the words, she was visualizing the bullet's journey, a parabolic arc through invisible warring rivers of air. She finally looked through the scope. The Leupold Mark IV optic brought the distant world into sharp focus. The steel plate shimmered in the magnified view, a tiny rectangle of certainty in a chaotic landscape. She took her right glove off with her teeth and tucked it into her jacket. Her bare finger rested on the trigger, feeling the cold, machined steel. The Marines saw the motion. It was another small detail, another piece of the ritual. A gloved finger could never feel the subtle break of a trigger with the same intimacy. She began to apply her hold. Instead of dialing the windage and elevation knobs, she moved the crosshairs themselves. She aimed high, placing the horizontal stadia line far above the target. Then she aimed to the right, placing the vertical line into the empty space beside it. To the untrained eye, it looked like she was aiming at nothing. To the snipers watching, it was a terrifyingly confident calculation. She was using the grid inside her scope, the mil-dot reticle, as a ruler against the world. Gunny Thorne watched her through his own scope. He saw the fine tremor in the crosshairs steady and then cease entirely. He saw her chest rise and fall, slowly, then stop. She was in the respiratory pause, the moment of perfect stillness after an exhale. The world seemed to hold its breath with her. The only sound was the relentless howl of the wind. The shot broke the silence with a sharp, violent crack that echoed off the granite walls. It was not the angry roar of Davies's firing, it was a single, clean, surgical sound. The recoil pushed the rifle back into her shoulder, a firm and familiar shove. She didn't flinch. She rode the recoil, her eyes still pressed to the scope, her technique flawless. She was already watching for the bullet's impact. For a long second, there was nothing. Then, a sound returned across the vast distance, not the ping of a miss on rock, but a deep, resonant clang, the unmistakable sound of a 168-grain bowtail hollow-point bullet striking solid steel. Through the spotting scope, Thorne saw the target rock violently on its stand, a fresh silver scar appearing dead center. "Impact," he said, his voice flat, betraying no emotion. But he did not take his eye from the scope. A collective, involuntary sound came from the assembled Marines, a soft exhalation of disbelief. Davies's sneer had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed stare. He looked from the distant target back to the woman lying motionless behind his rifle. It didn't make sense. It was a lucky shot. It had to be. "Send it again," Sharma said, her voice unchanged. She worked the bolt on the rifle with a smooth, practiced motion, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a new round. The brass spun through the air, a tiny golden arc against the gray sky. She settled back into her position. Once again she held her breath. Once again the rifle cracked. And once again, 1.5 seconds later, the authoritative clang of steel on steel echoed back across the mountain. Thorne looked through his scope. A new silver mark had appeared, less than an inch from the first. He finally pulled his head back and looked at Sharma. She was already moving, getting up from the ground with the same fluid grace she had shown getting into position. She picked up her glove, slapped the dust from her pants, and looked at the lieutenant. "The updraft is consistent," she said, as if giving a weather report. "Hold 0.2 of a mil high and you'll negate it. The windage call's good." She had not only made the impossible shot twice, she had diagnosed the problem, tested the solution, and handed it back to them as a simple instruction. She had not gloated. She had not even smiled. She had simply solved the puzzle. The silence on the ridgeline was now one of profound, uncomfortable respect. The mockery had been vaporized. In its place was a dawning, shocking realization. The woman with the clipboard was not just an officer. She was a shooter, a master-class shooter. It was in that moment, as she turned away from the rifle and the sun caught her face at a sharp angle, that Gunny Thorne saw it. It wasn't a large, dramatic scar. It was a faint, silvery crescent, almost invisible, nestled right at the outside edge of her right eyebrow. A tiny, perfect arc of healed tissue. He knew that scar. Every long-range shooter knew it. It was the kiss of the scope, a brand earned when a shooter got too close to the optic on a high-caliber rifle and the recoil slammed it back into their brow. It was a beginner's mistake, but it was also a mark that every professional earned at least once in their career. It was a sign of thousands of hours spent behind a rifle, of a life lived in the narrow, magnified world of the scope. It was a sniper's scar, and it told him more about her than any file or directive ever could. The fragile piece of their newfound respect was shattered by the crackle of a radio. Lieutenant Miller's platoon sergeant answered the call, his face growing grim as he listened. He held the handset out to the lieutenant. "Sir, it's for you, from battalion." The atmosphere on the ridgeline shifted instantly. The training exercise, the impossible shots, the bruised egos, all of it evaporated, replaced by the cold, immediate tension of a real-world problem. Miller took the radio, his voice suddenly tight with authority. "This is Miller. Go ahead." He listened for a full minute, his eyes scanning the jagged peaks to the north. His face paled. "Understood," he said finally, handing the radio back. He turned to his men, his expression serious. "Pack it up. We have a new mission." The platoon moved with a sudden jarring efficiency. Gear was stowed, weapons were checked, and the casual air of the training range was replaced by a focused, predatory silence. Sharma watched, her own mind already shifting gears. "What is it, Lieutenant?" she asked. Miller hesitated, as if unsure whether to include her. The old habit of exclusion died hard, but after what had just happened, ignoring her was no longer an option. An Osprey went down, weather-related. About 20 clicks north of here, deep in the minarets. 2 pilots, 2 crew chiefs. Their emergency beacon is active, but it's weak. The minarets were a notoriously treacherous cluster of granite spires and glacial valleys, a place where the weather could turn from clear skies to a whiteout blizzard in minutes. A rescue mission there was a nightmare scenario. "Battalion is spinning up a proper search and rescue team with air support," Miller continued, "but they're hours out, and the storm front that took down the Osprey is moving this way. We're the closest asset. We're tasked with moving to the crash site on foot, stabilizing any survivors, and securing the location until the recovery team arrives." He pointed to a jagged peak on the horizon. "The beacon is putting them somewhere on the western face of that ridge. It's bad country." Corporal Davies, his earlier arrogance replaced by a grim focus, spoke up. "We can take the eastern approach, sir. Follow the valley floor. It's longer, but it'll keep us out of the worst of the wind." Miller nodded, pulling out a laminated map. "Agreed. It's the textbook approach. We'll move fast, light, and—" "That's a mistake," Sharma cut in. Her voice was quiet, but carried an undeniable weight. Every head turned towards her. Davies' face tightened with a flash of his old resentment. "With all due respect, Major," Miller said, his tone strained, "this is a Marine recon operation. We know this terrain." "You know it in summer," she countered, her gaze fixed on the darkening sky to the north. That valley is a natural funnel. When this storm hits, it will become a wind tunnel, and the snow will drift dozens of feet deep. You won't be walking through it, you'll be drowning in it. The textbook approach will get you killed. She pointed to a different ridge, a higher, more exposed route that looked far more dangerous. The high ground is your only option. The wind will be brutal, but it will scour the snow from the rock. The footing will be treacherous, but it will be there. The valley will be a tomb. Her certainty was absolute, born not from a map, but from a deep intuitive understanding of how mountains behave. She spoke of the wind and snow not as weather, but as active, hostile forces. Miller was caught. His training, his maps, and his platoon's consensus pointed one way. This outsider, this woman who had just humiliated his best shooter, pointed the other. To follow her advice would be to cede his authority, to admit that she knew his job better than he did. To ignore her could mean leading his men into a trap. As if on cue, the wind shifted. The temperature dropped several degrees in a matter of seconds. The sky, which had been a pale, washed-out blue, was now being consumed by a bruised, purple-gray mass of cloud rolling in from the north. The first snowflakes, tiny and hard as sand, began to sting their faces. The storm was coming, and it was coming faster than anyone had anticipated. The environment was turning against them. The distant peaks, once sharp and clear, were already blurring, their edges softened by the encroaching veil of snow. The radio crackled again, but this time it was just a burst of static. The atmospheric pressure was dropping, playing havoc with the frequencies. Their digital compasses began to flicker, confused by the magnetic interference from the iron-rich granite of the mountains. The technology they relied upon was beginning to fail. They were being stripped down to the fundamentals, a map, a compass, and the skill in their heads. "Lieutenant, we need to move," Gunny Thorne said, his voice urgent. He was looking at Sharma, then back at the darkening valley. He had spent his life in places like this, and he recognized the signs. She was right. The valley was a death trap. The decision was no longer a matter of pride for Lieutenant Miller. It was a matter of survival. The snowflakes were thicker now, no longer stinging, but landing with a soft, ominous hiss. Visibility was dropping, the world shrinking to a gray, swirling circle around them. His map was becoming an abstract representation of a landscape he could no longer see. His plan, conceived in the clear air of the morning, was now useless. He looked at Sharma. She stood with her pack already on, her face calm and unreadable, her gaze fixed on the high ridge she had indicated. She was not waiting for his decision, she was waiting for him to catch up to the reality of the situation. Her quiet confidence was more commanding than any shouted order. "All right," Miller said, the word tasting like defeat. "We take the high route. Major, you have the lead on navigation." The transfer of authority was unspoken, but absolute. He had not relinquished his command, but he had conceded his expertise. He had tacitly placed the lives of his men in her hands. Davies stared at her, his expression a complex mixture of anger, disbelief, and a grudging, nascent respect. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and fell into line without a word. Sharma simply nodded. She pulled a traditional compass from her pouch, a simple, reliable instrument that would not fail her, took a quick bearing, and started moving. "Keep a 5-meter interval," she ordered, her voice cutting cleanly through the rising wind. "Watch your footing. The rock is icing over." The Marines followed, a line of ghosts moving into the teeth of the storm. The ascent was a brutal, vertical fight. The wind was a physical force, trying to tear them from the mountainside. Snow, driven almost horizontally, sandblasted any exposed skin and worked its way into the seams of their clothing. The world was reduced to the few feet of rock visible in front of them and the back of the person ahead. There was no conversation, only the sound of labored breathing and the crunch of boots on ice-slicked stone. Sharma moved like a mountain goat, her steps certain and precise. She seemed to have an innate sense of the terrain, finding handholds and footholds that were all but invisible. She did not hesitate. She flowed over the rock, her movements a model of efficiency that the heavily muscled Marines struggled to replicate. They were strong, but she was balanced. They relied on power, but she relied on technique. An hour into the climb, a young private named Chen slipped. His feet went out from under him on a patch of black ice, and he began to slide towards a sheer drop. Before anyone could even shout a warning, Sharma had pivoted. She dropped to one knee, bracing herself, and her arm shot out, her hand grabbing the strap of Chen's pack. The momentum of his fall jerked her hard, but her position was solid. She held him, her muscles straining, for the few seconds it took for Gunny Thorne to scramble down and help haul the terrified Marine back to safety. Sharma didn't say a word. She just gave Chen a quick assessing look, saw that he was shaken but unhurt, and then turned to continue the climb. The incident was over in less than 10 seconds, but it sent a ripple of understanding through the platoon. She wasn't just a navigator, she was a protector. Her awareness was total. They found the crash site just as the last of the daylight failed. The Osprey's fuselage was a mangled wreck, wedged between two massive granite boulders. The snow around it was stained with hydraulic fluid and jet fuel. The emergency beacon was a faint, pathetic chirp, soon to be silenced by the cold. 2 of the crew were dead, their bodies still strapped into their seats in the crushed cockpit. But 2 were alive. The pilot had a severe leg fracture, and the crew chief was suffering from a serious head injury and was drifting in and out of consciousness. They were hypothermic and in shock. Miller and the platoon's corpsman immediately began administering first aid, their movements frantic in the failing light and swirling snow. They needed to get the survivors warm and stabilized, fast. As they worked, Sharma did not tend to the wounded. Instead, she began a slow, deliberate circle of the crash site, her M4 carbine held at a low ready. Her head was on a constant swivel, her eyes scanning the shadows beyond the wreckage. "Major, what are you doing?" Miller called out, his voice strained. "We need help here." "You're a rescue party," she replied, her voice dangerously calm. "But you're also a target. An aircraft doesn't just fall out of the sky in a storm. Sometimes it's helped along." Davies, who was helping the corpsman splint the pilot's leg, scoffed. "It was the storm, Major. Battalion confirmed." "Battalion isn't here," she said, "and I saw scorch marks on the tail rotor assembly. They don't look like they came from an engine fire." Her words hung in the air, a chilling counterpoint to the howling wind. The idea of hostiles in this godforsaken wilderness seemed insane. This was a training area, a secure zone. But her certainty was unsettling. Thorne, who had been setting up a temporary shelter, paused. He looked at the wreckage, then at the dark, imposing shapes of the rocks surrounding them. He unslung his rifle. "She's right, Lieutenant. Perimeter, now." Miller, torn again, looked from the wounded men to Sharma's tense, alert posture. He made a decision. "Davies, Chen, with me. The rest of you stay with the doc and the gunny. Get them warm." The 3 Marines moved out, spreading into the darkness. They were moving into a blind, hostile space, their senses dulled by the storm. Davies, still smarting from the day's events, was determined to prove his worth. He moved too fast, too aggressively, crashing through the snow-covered undergrowth, his weapon light cutting a frantic, revealing swath through the darkness. "Corporal, control your light," Sharma's voice came over the radio, a sharp, whispered command. "You're painting a target on yourself." "I'm trying to see, Major," Davies hissed back, his frustration boiling over. "Maybe you can use your magic powers, but I need a—" His words were cut off by the dry snap of a twig from the rocks above him. It was a tiny sound, almost lost in the wind, but in the sudden silence it was as loud as a gunshot. Davies froze. He swung his light up towards the sound. A figure was there, rising from behind a boulder, clad in white snow camouflage, holding a rifle, not one of their own. Davies reacted on pure instinct and aggression. He raised his rifle to fire, his light perfectly illuminating both his target and himself. It was a fatal mistake. A second figure, unseen, opened fire from an angle to Davies's left. The muzzle flash was a brilliant, shocking star in the darkness. The burst of automatic fire tore through the air where Davies had been a split second before. He had been saved not by his skill, but by a sudden, violent shove from his right that sent him tumbling into the deep snow. Sharma had been moving towards him in the dark, silent and unseen. She had anticipated his mistake, anticipated the enemy's reaction. The moment his light went up, she had lunged, pushing him out of the line of fire while simultaneously bringing her own rifle up. She didn't fire a wild burst. She fired 2 precise, controlled shots, 2 pops barely louder than the wind. She wasn't aiming at the shooter. She was aiming at the large, snow-laden pine branch directly above him. The branch, severed at its base by the rounds, dropped with a heavy whump, dumping hundreds of pounds of snow and wood onto the enemy position. There was a muffled cry, then silence. The first shooter, momentarily blinded by his partner's muzzle flash and confused by the sudden chaos, hesitated. It was all the time Sharma needed. She was already moving, using the darkness and the storm as her allies. She melted into the shadows, circling around to the flank. Lieutenant Miller, pinned down behind a rock, saw a brief fleeting shape in the swirling snow, a flicker of movement, impossibly fast and quiet. Then he heard a series of soft, methodical sounds from the enemy position, a choked gasp, the clatter of a rifle on rock, a heavy sigh. Then silence. A moment later, Sharma's voice came over the radio, her breathing perfectly even. Perimeter is clear. 2 hostiles neutralized. Miller and Chen moved forward cautiously. They found the 2 men. They were dressed in non-standard military gear, carrying suppressed weapons. One was half buried under the snow-laden branch, incapacitated with a broken shoulder. The other lay a few feet away, a knife wound in his throat, precise and fatal. He had never even seen her coming. Davies was sitting up in the snow, his face as white as the ground around him. He stared at the spot where the enemy shooter had been, then at Sharma as she emerged from the darkness. She had not only saved his life, she had done it by outthinking and outfighting an enemy he hadn't even known was there. His aggression would have gotten him killed. Her discipline had won the fight before it truly began. The confrontation was over. Her training had not just outperformed his aggression, it had rendered it obsolete. The debriefing room at the mountain warfare base was sterile and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaotic violence of the previous night. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a flat, unforgiving glare on the faces of the men seated around the polished table. Lieutenant Miller, Gunny Thorne, and a visibly subdued Corporal Davies sat on one side. On the other sat Major Sharma and the base commander, a full colonel with a face like carved oak. The rescued pilots, now safe in the base infirmary, had already given their statements. They had confirmed seeing 2 men with rifles near their crash site just before Miller's team arrived. The neutralized hostiles were mercenaries, part of a cell operating in the region, likely responsible for the downing of the Osprey using a shoulder-fired missile and waiting to salvage sensitive electronics from the wreckage. The colonel had read the preliminary after-action report. He now looked at Miller. Lieutenant, your report states that you initially planned to approach the crash site through the valley. What changed your mind? Miller sat up straighter. This was the moment of truth. He could have tried to take credit, to spin the story. Instead, he looked across the table at Sharma. Major Sharma advised against it, sir. She assessed that the valley would be a fatal trap once the storm hit. She recommended the high-altitude traverse. She was right. The colonel's gaze shifted to Sharma. It was a look of intense scrutiny. The report also details a contact with hostile forces. It states, Major, that you took tactical command of the situation and neutralized 2 combatants, saving the life of Corporal Davies. Is that accurate? Before Sharma could answer, Davies spoke, his voice low and hoarse. It is, sir. I made a mistake. I was reckless. I exposed my position. Major Sharma pushed me out of the line of fire and eliminated the threat. If it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be here. The admission hung in the sterile air. It was a raw, public confession of failure and a direct acknowledgement of her superiority. It had cost him every ounce of his pride to say it, and in doing so, he had gained a measure of something far more valuable: integrity. The colonel leaned back, his fingers steepled. He looked from Davies's humbled face to Miller's straightforward testimony, and finally to Sharma, who had remained silent, her expression neutral. The narrative was clear. The official reports would codify it, but the truth was already established in this room. The culture of the platoon had been tested, its arrogance broken, and its hierarchy inverted by undeniable competence. Major Sharma, the colonel said, his tone formal but laced with a new, profound respect. Your official evaluation of this platoon will be interesting to read, but your actions speak for themselves. You saved the lives of 4 men yesterday. The Marine Corps is in your debt. Sharma simply inclined her head. I was doing my job, Colonel. Later, after the official debrief was over, the platoon was gathered in their ready room, cleaning their weapons in a tired, contemplative silence. The usual loud jokes and boisterous energy were gone, replaced by a quiet, focused atmosphere. When Sharma entered, the room did not fall silent, but the quality of the silence changed. It was no longer exclusionary. It was respectful. Private Chen, the young Marine she had saved from falling, walked over and handed her a steaming mug of coffee. "Figured you could use this, ma'am," he said, unable to quite meet her eyes. "Thank you, Private," she said, accepting the mug. Davies was sitting on a bench, meticulously disassembling the bolt of his rifle. He looked up as she passed. He didn't say anything, but he met her gaze and gave a short, sharp nod. It was a gesture of concession, of thanks, of respect. It was more eloquent than any apology. Gunny Thorne was standing by the window, looking out at the now clear, snow-covered mountains. He gestured for her to join him. "I was watching you on the range yesterday," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Before you took the shot, the way you built your position, the way you breathe." He paused, then looked at her, his eyes drifting for a fraction of a second to the small, silvery scar above her eyebrow. "You've spent a lot of time behind a rifle." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact from one professional to another. He wasn't asking about her past or what unit she really came from. He was acknowledging their shared tribe, the small, quiet brotherhood and sisterhood of those who have mastered the lonely art of the long-range shot. "Some," Sharma replied, her voice just as quiet. She took a sip of her coffee, the warmth spreading through her. She looked out at the vast, impersonal beauty of the mountains, the same peaks that had tried to kill them just hours before. The perception of the men in the room had shifted, not because of an order, not because of her rank, but because she had shown them, in the clearest and most unforgiving terms, who she was. The consequences had fallen where they belonged. The culture had been irrevocably altered. Strength is not the power to dominate, but the discipline to wait for the one perfect moment to act.